All right, now to give us more perspective in terms of what is happening at this moment in the Russia-Ukraine war, we're being joined by retired Colonel Rich Audzen, who's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and the Jamestown Foundation, and is joining us live from Washington, D.C. Mr. Audzen, thank you very much indeed, sir, for joining us here on WION. Let me, in fact, start off by asking you this. You know, the fact that Ukraine has managed to make some pretty impressive gains as part of its Kursk incursion has been talked about a lot. The fact is, on the Eastern Front, Ukraine is quite clearly on the back foot in Pokrovsk. Do you think at this moment Ukraine is risking potentially losing more territory on its Eastern Front, even though it is making gains in Kursk?
Well, it's good to be with you. I think obviously that is a risk. It's a calculated risk, though. I think so far Russia has responded by increasing its pressure in its own offensive and taking some risk in Kursk by only sending sort of light troops and some new troops to that area, not its most battle-hardened combat troops. So it's sort of a gamble on both sides. Putin is gambling that he can take advantage of the Kursk operation and Zelensky's counteroffensive to get what he's been pushing for the last 2 or 3 months, which is in the Pokrovsk and the territory on that main battle line that he wants. But it's interesting. He also has been saying that they can stop the Kursk offensive with the troops they have in place, and that hasn't played out. So right now, the risk and the gamble is really incumbent on both men, on Putin and on Zelensky.
Right, and also considering that this war has in fact gone on for almost 2.5 years now, one of the big challenges that Ukraine has in finding enough soldiers who'll actually go and fight the war. There are reports that have appeared in places like the BBC, which says that there are families in Pokrovsk who are asking young men of fighting age to go into hiding. Otherwise, they'd be sent to the front lines to face the Russian onslaught. How bad do you think the situation is for the Ukrainian defenders at the moment?
Well, I don't think it's critical at this point. They've been in hard places before, and what they have chosen to do in previous Russian offensives has been to slowly retreat or slowly move back, but to make the Russians pay a huge price for every additional square kilometer of territory they take. Now, on the broader point about mobilization, though, I think Ukraine can be criticized for not going as deep as they could. Full mobilization of 18 years and older, for instance. There's more that they could be doing with Ukrainians living outside the country. I don't think they're in a critical shortage of manpower, but it clearly is a disadvantage vis-a-vis the Russians. So this is another area, just like the war in the air and the war on the ground. It's the war of mobilizing and getting enough young men to fight. And there, again, they might be on the wrong foot, but they're not in critical territory yet.
And also the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, as we speak, is in Kiev. He's said it many times before, and he said it again in his visit as well. He said that the way forward is dialogue, and this time for war is over, because war does not solve any conflict. Do you think Prime Minister Modi can actually play a role in trying to bring about some kind of a truce between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, I think the voice of interested third parties, India is doing this, and Turkey has done it before. There's other countries counseling for a ceasefire and negotiations to end the war. However, I don't think it's actually true that war never solves conflict. So ultimately, war is part of how countries solve the differences between the two of them. But in this case, you have close to a strategic stalemate. Both sides are hurting the other side. Ukraine is trying to prove now that it can inflict damage in Russia on the Russians on their own territory, just as well as the Russians can. Now, in a sense, this is a prerequisite for solid negotiations. If Putin thinks he's winning and is paying less cost than the Ukrainians, then he has very little reason to negotiate a peace on compromise terms. He thinks he can impose peace on his own terms. And that's why I think this is a very important time for the Ukrainians to strike some blows so that both sides realize they're paying a price and should come to the table.
You know, it's interesting that you mention about how this incursion by the Ukrainians can play a role in the negotiations if they happen, because the Russians have said that negotiations are now off the table. The Ukrainians are saying that they want to negotiate better, and that's why the Kursk incursion is happening. But looking at how long Ukraine can actually continue with its Kursk incursion, do you think that's a strategy that can pay off if this war, as is expected, continues to go on?
Well, I think Kursk is one part of it, but I think this, what your correspondent covered earlier, is actually the more important part. That's these airstrikes that Ukraine, using its kamikaze drones and special operations forces, Now they're blowing up valuable Russian aircraft. They're pushing back. This was 400 kilometers into Russia, the attack on Thursday at the air bases at Kalach-na-Donya. So I think this is a development very much worth watching, because Russia is starting to feel the pain of the conflict and losing some of its air assets very deep onto its own territory. I think in the end that will be more important than the Kursk operation. The Kursk operation is valuable for embarrassing Putin at the loss of territory, but it's these airstrikes that actually can change the calculus, I think, at the front.
All right, very interesting. Thank you very much indeed, Colonel Outzen, for joining us and getting his dark perspective there. For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.